The first sign that something was wrong was the banner. It hung above the private dining room like a proud announcement, celebrating the Mercer home saved by family. At first glance, it looked harmless, almost sweet, the kind of sentimental decoration people put up when a crisis has passed and everyone wants to believe the worst is finally over. But the longer I looked at it, the heavier something settled in my chest. Because the story that banner was celebrating wasn't true. My name is Elena Mercer, and I was 28 years old the night my family gathered to celebrate the person who had supposedly saved our home. The restaurant sat just outside Tacoma, a place my parents loved because the lighting was warm and the staff remembered regular customers by name. My father had already ordered a round of drinks before everyone had even finished sitting down. Lucas sat at the center of the table. My older brother had always looked comfortable in rooms like this, shoulders relaxed, tie slightly loosened, the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in a story. My Aunt Lorraine leaned toward him with a wide smile. "Your father told everyone what you did," she said. "Handling the bank like that, not many people could have saved the house." Lucas gave a modest shrug. Someone had to step up. Across the table, my mother nodded proudly. "You've always been the dependable one." I kept my hands wrapped around my glass, listening to the conversation bend around him like gravity. No one asked me anything. No one even looked my way. Lucas had always been the one people celebrated. I had always been the one people quietly relied on. My father lifted his whiskey and cleared his throat, the way he always did before making a speech. "Tonight," he announced, voice loud and slightly unsteady, "we celebrate the son who saved this family." The table erupted in applause. I stared at my brother, then at the banner above us. Everyone at the table believed Lucas had saved the house. The only problem was, I had been paying the mortgage for 4 years. The applause faded, but the story kept growing. It moved around the table the way family stories always do, picked up by one voice, repeated by another, polished a little more each time until it sounded almost inevitable. My Aunt Lorraine was the first to carry it forward. She leaned across the table toward one of our cousins, lowering her voice just enough to sound confidential while still letting half the room hear. "You know," she said with a proud smile, "Lucas was the one who dealt with the bank when things got complicated. Those mortgage people can be ruthless." Across the table, my mother gave a small approving nod. "That's true," she added gently. "Your brother handled a lot more than we expected." Handled. The word hung there. Lucas swirled the drink in his glass, watching the amber liquid move as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. One of my cousins leaned forward. "Seriously, you negotiated with the bank." Lucas lifted his shoulders in a relaxed shrug. "It wasn't that dramatic," he replied. "Just paperwork and phone calls. Somebody had to make sure things stayed under control." A few people chuckled approvingly. "That sounds like Lucas," Lorraine said, "always steady when it matters." My mother's hand briefly rested on his arm. "You've always been dependable." I sat there listening, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. No one at the table looked confused. No one hesitated. The story made perfect sense to them. Of course Lucas had handled the mortgage. Of course Lucas had saved the house. The version of events they were telling moved so smoothly it almost felt rehearsed. Almost. Because 3 years earlier, on a quiet Tuesday night, my phone had lit up with a call from my father, his voice shaking in a way I had never heard before. And that call had not been about Lucas. It had been about me. Across the table, my father lifted his drink again, clearly enjoying the admiration building around my brother. Then he spoke the sentence that made the room nod in agreement. Lucas handled everything with the bank. 3 years earlier. My phone lit up just after 10 at night. I almost ignored it. Calls from my parents that late usually meant one of two things: my mother worrying about something small, or my father wanting to talk longer than either of us had energy for. But something about the way the phone kept ringing made me answer. "Hello," for a moment. All I heard was breathing. Then my father's voice came through, quieter than I had ever heard it. "Elena, are you busy?" "No," I said slowly. "What's wrong?" A pause stretched across the line. Then he exhaled sharply. "We're behind on the mortgage." The words felt strange in the air. "How far behind? 2 months?" He admitted. "The bank sent a notice today." I sat down on the edge of my bed. Behind him, I could hear my mother whispering something. Then the phone shifted. "Elena," my mother said quickly, her voice tight with urgency. "We just need a little help until things stabilize." "How much? 2,150 each month?" My father murmured. I did the math automatically in my head. Mortgage payment, late fees, utilities tied to the property. "Why not tell Lucas?" I asked. The reaction was immediate. "No," my mother answered, almost too quickly. "He has so much going on right now. A lot of pressure at work." My father hesitated before speaking again. "Elena, please keep this between us." I frowned slightly. "Why?" There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, "Your brother already carries a lot of expectations in this family. Your mother and I don't want people thinking we had to rely on you." The words settled heavily in the silence between us. I stared at the wall of my apartment, thinking about the house I had grown up in, the creaky staircase, the small kitchen window that looked out toward the backyard maple tree. "Finally," I said the only thing that would end the panic in their voices. "I'll cover it for now." My mother's relief was immediate. "Oh, sweetheart, just until we recover," my father added softly. "We'll pay you back." The next morning, I opened my banking app. For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, wondering if I had just made the biggest financial mistake of my life. Then I set it up anyway. Auto payment, mortgage account, $2,150. The first transfer left my account on the 5th of the month, then another, then another. That money wasn't spare change. It was the down payment I had been saving for my own home. But every month the payment went through, and every month the house stayed out of foreclosure. By the time the story at the dinner table began rewriting itself, 48 payments had already been made. The restaurant noise slowly returned after the applause. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed near the far end of the table. Waiters moved quietly between chairs refilling water, but the conversation never really left my brother. Lorraine was still smiling at him. I told everyone. She continued. "Lucas stepped in when things were getting messy with the house." My cousin leaned forward. "Dealing with banks is brutal. You must have spent hours on the phone." Lucas tilted his head slightly, the way he always did when people complimented him. "It took some time," he replied casually. "But that's part of being responsible." My mother's eyes softened. "You've always been responsible." I took a sip of water, focusing on the condensation sliding down the glass, across the table. My father was on his second whiskey. His voice had grown louder with every drink. He looked from Lucas to me, then back again. "You know," he began, tapping his glass against the table for emphasis. "This is what real reliability looks like." A few relatives turned their heads. My father gestured loosely toward my brother. "Lucas doesn't panic. When things get hard, he steps in." Someone murmured agreement. Then his eyes landed on me, and the tone changed. "Elena," he said slowly, "you should really learn from your brother." The sentence hung in the air like a slap. A few people shifted in their chairs. My Aunt Lorraine nodded immediately. "That's true," she added. "Lucas has always been the steady one." My mother didn't interrupt. She simply watched Lucas with quiet pride. Across the table, my brother offered a small smile, the kind meant to look humble. I stared down at the tablecloth. For years I had learned how to stay quiet in moments like this. But tonight, the comparison didn't stop. My father lifted his glass again, voice rising as the alcohol loosened his restraint. "Not everyone in this family understands responsibility," he continued. He raised his drink toward Lucas like a toast. but this one does." Then he delivered the sentence that made everyone nod in agreement. Lucas saved this family. For a moment after my father's toast, the table filled with polite applause. Not loud, not enthusiastic, just enough clapping to acknowledge the moment. Lucas lifted his glass with an easy smile, accepting the praise like it belonged to him. Across from him, my mother looked relieved. Lorraine nodded approvingly. A few cousins leaned closer, clearly impressed by the story that had just been told. I watched all of it, the pride, the certainty, the quiet agreement settling around the table, a version of events that erased me completely. Something inside me settled, not anger exactly, something colder, clearer. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped lightly against the floor. At first, no one noticed. The conversation was still flowing around Lucas, still circling the same story. Then I stood. A few heads turned. My father lowered his glass halfway to the table, blinking as if he had just remembered I was still there. "What is it?" he asked. I looked at Lucas first, then at my parents. Finally, I spoke. "Well," I said calmly, "that's actually great news." My aunt frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "If Lucas saved the house," I continued, "then he can reimburse the payments." The words landed like a dropped glass. Conversation stopped instantly. My father's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. What payments, he asked? Lucas looked up from his drink, the smile fading slightly. My mother went very still. Around the table, relatives glanced at one another. I held my father's gaze. Then I answered quietly. 48 mortgage payments. For several seconds after my words, the room stayed perfectly still. My father stared at me as if he hadn't heard correctly. 48. What he muttered. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up as I unlocked it. My banking app was still open. I walked to the center of the table and placed the phone down between the plates and glasses. "Here," I said quietly. No one moved at first. Then my cousin leaned forward. On the screen was a long list of transactions. $2,150, $2,150, $2,150. Every payment sent on the 5th of the month. The destination account name was clearly listed at the top. Mercer Residence Mortgage. The sender's name appeared beside every transfer. Elena Mercer. Lorraine leaned closer. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the list slowly with one finger. "Wait," she murmured. Another cousin leaned over her shoulder. "That goes back years." 48 transfers. 48 months. Across the table, Lucas stopped smiling. My father leaned forward, squinting at the screen. That can't be right," he muttered. My mother took a quick step toward the table. "Elena," she said sharply, "this isn't appropriate." But no one was looking at her anymore. The phone had already started moving from one person to another, each relative scrolling through the same long list of payments, each one doing the same silent math. $2,150 times 48? The whispers started quietly. "Is this real? She paid all of that. That's over $100,000. I stayed where I was, watching the room slowly shift. The story they had been celebrating all evening was still hanging in the air, but now something inside it had cracked, and one by one, every person at that table began turning to look at me. The whispers spread quickly. At first, they were soft, confused murmurs between cousins. Quiet questions passed across the table. "Is that real? 48 payments?" Someone leaned forward to read the phone screen more carefully. Lorraine was still holding it. She scrolled again and again. The same number appeared beside every transfer, $2,150. The same date, the 5th of the month. The same sender's name, Elena Mercer. Lorraine blinked several times, as if the letters might rearrange themselves. That must be a mistake, she said weakly. My mother stood frozen beside the table, her hands clasped tightly together. Elena, she whispered sharply, this isn't appropriate. I didn't answer. Lorraine handed the phone to my cousin. He scrolled through the transactions slowly, his eyebrows rising higher with each one. Wait, he murmured. This goes back years. Another cousin leaned over his shoulder. That's every month. Across the table. Lucas sat perfectly still. My father leaned forward, squinting at the screen now in my cousin's hands. That can't be right, he muttered. But the evidence kept moving around the table, one person after another scrolling through the same list. 48 transfers, 48 months. One of my uncles spoke quietly from the end of the table. 2,150 times 48. He shook his head. That's over $100,000. The room grew even quieter. My father slowly lifted his eyes from the phone and looked at me. You. Paid that he asked hoarsely. My mother took a step forward. That's enough, she said sharply. Give me the phone. But no one moved, because everyone was still doing the same silent math. Across the table, Lucas hadn't touched his drink in several minutes. He was staring at the table. Not at me, not at the phone, just staring. And suddenly, the story everyone had been celebrating all evening didn't sound quite so certain anymore. The room stayed quiet, not the polite silence from earlier in the evening. This one felt heavier, because now everyone at the table was thinking the same thing. If Elena had been paying the mortgage, then what exactly had Lucas done? Lorraine was the first to say it out loud. She looked across the table at my brother. Well then, why? She asked slowly. Have we been hearing that you handled everything? Lucas shifted in his seat. I never said that, he replied quickly. His voice sounded tighter now. I just helped organize paperwork. Mom and Dad were stressed. I tried to keep things running smoothly. My mother looked at him as if searching for confirmation. That's what you told us, she said quietly. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't think the details mattered. Across the table, I studied his face. And suddenly, a memory surfaced. 2 years earlier, a Sunday afternoon at the house. Lucas had been standing near the kitchen counter while I reviewed a mortgage notice my parents had left on the table. He had glanced at the document, then at me. You're covering this, he had asked quietly. I remembered the way I nodded and the way he had paused, thinking, back in the restaurant. I looked directly at him. You knew, I said. Lucas didn't answer, not immediately. That silence was enough. Lorraine leaned forward again. You knew she was paying the mortgage, she asked. Lucas exhaled slowly. I knew she was helping, he said. But I didn't realize she was doing all of it. No one at the table seemed convinced, because the phone with the payment history was still sitting between the plates. 48 months. 48 transfers. One by one. Relatives began turning their heads toward Lucas, and suddenly, the entire room was staring at my brother. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Not the polite silence from earlier in the evening, the kind that fills space between toasts and compliments. This silence felt heavier, because now everyone was looking at the same thing. The phone, the payments, and my brother. Lorraine slowly leaned back in her chair. Well, she murmured awkwardly, that changes things. No one laughed. Across the table, one of my cousins whispered to another, 48 months. That's over $100,000. Another relative shook his head quietly. I thought Lucas handled the bank. Lucas shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence completely gone. I didn't say I paid it, he insisted, though the words sounded weaker than he probably intended. I just helped Mom and Dad deal with the paperwork. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. And you didn't think to mention your sister was paying the mortgage. Lucas didn't answer. Across the table, my father was still staring at the phone. The list of payments. Month after month. Year after year. Finally, he looked up at me. You paid all that he asked again. His voice rough. Before I could respond, I turned to my mother. Mom, I said quietly. She looked up slowly. You knew where that money was coming from. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Why didn't you say anything tonight? The question hung in the air. My mother pressed a hand against her mouth. Her eyes wet now. We never meant for it to look like this. She whispered. I let out a quiet breath. For 3 years I had watched this story grow quietly, carefully, until it erased me completely. Around the table, relatives began speaking again, but the tone had changed. No admiration now, just confusion, and something close to disappointment. My brother sat very still. The hero of the evening had disappeared. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. Every conversation faded again. I looked at my parents first, then at Lucas. Finally, I spoke. You didn't just forget, I said quietly. A pause settled across the table. You erased me. 2 weeks passed after the dinner. For a family that used to fill every group chat and phone call with noise, the silence felt almost unnatural. No one argued. No one tried to rewrite the story again. Life simply paused. In the meantime, mine moved forward. Bellevue looked different from Tacoma taller buildings, quieter streets at night, the steady rhythm of people who didn't know anything about my family's dinner celebration or the moment the story collapsed. My apartment overlooked a stretch of lights flickering across the water. Most evenings, I sat on the small balcony with a cup of tea and let the quiet settle around me. One night, a knock came at the door. When I opened it, my parents were standing in the hallway. My father looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier. Elena. He began slowly. May we come in? I stepped aside. Inside. My mother clasped her hands together as if rehearsing what she wanted to say. We should have told the truth sooner, she said finally. My father nodded slowly. We let the story grow because it was easier than admitting we needed help. Neither of them mentioned Lucas. Not once. Then my father cleared his throat. We spoke with a lawyer. He added, We want to add your name to the house. My mother looked hopeful. You paid for it. It should belong to you too. For a moment I imagined the house again. The old staircase. The maple tree outside the kitchen window. But the feeling that came with that memory had already changed. I shook my head gently. I don't want the house. They looked surprised. What I needed, I said quietly, was the truth. Silence filled the room. When they finally left, I stepped onto the balcony and looked out at the city lights. For years they told a story where I didn't exist. That night, I finally told my own. Sometimes the hardest place to be seen is inside your own family. Many people grow up learning to stay quiet just to keep the peace, helping, supporting, fixing problems behind the scenes while someone else receives the praise. Over time, that silence can slowly turn into invisibility. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, not through shouting, not through revenge, but through the simple courage to say, this is what really happened. And sometimes that single moment of honesty can change an entire story. If you've ever felt overlooked, compared to someone else, or quietly carrying more than anyone realizes, you're not alone. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts below and consider subscribing for more stories about finding your voice and reclaiming your place in the narrative.